This was a much more emboldened President Trump than the first speech he made there at the UN during his first term. You heard them there early on, essentially trashing the UN and pointing fingers and admonishing some of the countries there in the room, telling some of them that their countries are going to hell in terms of migration. You also you also heard him talk about Palestinian statehood and break from some U.S. allies who are recognizing Palestinian statehood. He said doing so would be rewarding Hamas. He also talked about the war in Ukraine, saying that he thought he could end it because of his relationship with Putin. And he also was really focused on climate change, saying that climate change is a con job. Of course, the overwhelming consensus of the scientific community is that climate change is very real and primarily caused by human behavior. We're going to have Daniel Dale on a little bit later to talk about some of what President Trump said, but I want to start with our Caitlin Collins. Caitlin, what stood out with you with this speech?
Well, Pam, obviously that went way beyond the allotted time limit for any world leader to come and speak at the United Nations, maybe even quadruple what the time limit typically is. And basically what you just heard from President Trump amounted to a very forceful lecture to the United Nations about not just the body itself, but also how the world leaders sitting in front of him are running their own countries. That comment that you just noted there, the president said he knows what he's talking about and said a lot of their countries are going to hell in his view. And he started out that speech, Pam, it was quite clear where it was going to go, as he was saying that basically the faulty equipment as he came inside the building here at the United Nations symbolized the uselessness of the United Nations in its current form. He said the United Nations has potential, but that it is not living up to that potential as it is right now. Pam, two things he was talking about. A broken teleprompter, apparently. You could see the president there was reading off of a script in front of him, though he certainly went off script many times during those remarks. But also, as he came in the building, he and the First Lady were going up an escalator. We were actually standing there in the lobby during that moment, and the escalator kind of malfunctioned and stopped halfway through, and they walked the rest of the way up. But the president mentioned that only moments into his speech and was basically pointing to that to make his argument, to kind of underscore his point overall here about the United Nations, as he then went on to lecture all of these nations, whether it was on climate change, whether it was on the war in Ukraine, as he was castigating European nations for still importing Russian oil, as that is something that he basically delivered an ultimatum to NATO earlier this month, saying he's prepared to put sanctions on Russia or on countries that continue to buy this oil, but that NATO countries have to stop doing so first. And so obviously nothing surprising in those comments, I'll note, but still remarkable to hear the president come here to the United Nations and, as you noted, Pam, emboldened in his view of how they're running their countries and how he's running his.
Absolutely. It was pretty stunning, actually. And we at points, Caitlin, when he was admonishing some of the countries, he mentioned Germany, for example, that the camera would pan to that world leader, and many of them were just stone-faced as the president was doing this. I think many of these world leaders were prepared for the kind of Donald Trump we saw here today. What do you think?
Yeah, and he's meeting with a lot of these world leaders, I'll also note, while he's here. I mean, he's just delivering the speech, but he's got meetings with President Zelensky, with a lot of the Middle East leaders later on when it comes to the creation of a Palestinian state, as he's been rebuking Canada, France, and all of these other European nations for recognizing a Palestinian state. So this is only just the beginning, as he's going to go and meet with all of these leaders.
I know you'll be covering all of that. Thank you so much, Caitlin. I want to bring in Christiana Amanpour and pick up on what Caitlin was talking about with President Trump essentially admonishing some of these countries when it comes to migration. He talked about how the UN is funding uncontrolled migration. Let's listen to specifically what he said and talk on the other side.
It's actually creating new problems for us to solve. The best example is the #1 political issue of our time, the crisis of uncontrolled migration. It's uncontrolled. Your countries are being ruined. The United Nations is funding an assault on Western countries and their borders.
Christiana, what do you make of those comments?
You know, Pamela, I differ slightly from Caitlin. I was actually really amazed by the level of vitriol that the President of the United States delivered to his allies, mostly to his allies, let's just face it. talking about your countries will fail to the Europeans, you know, saying that he had met President Lula for 39 nice seconds, but then banging them over the head again with the cudgel of tariffs. Don't forget, the U.S. has a tariff or a budget surplus with Lula. If you remember, his first inaugural talked about American carnage. This was a speech about global carnage as he sees it. This, in every single instance, was used to deliver a hammer blow against almost every nation in the world. Everything, using the United Nations podium to spout conspiracy theories about green agendas. Of course he's correct about uncontrolled migration. He has identified that issue. But the way he talks about how your countries will fail, there are many European countries who've actually implemented European standards on various migrations and the rest. And I'm going to be speaking to the Prime Minister of Spain about it, as well about Palestinian statehood. I'm going to be speaking to the Foreign Minister of Brazil about what the President said about Brazil. But it was an incredible broadside. And what wasn't said was how he was going to actually intervene and use American power and its leverage, unique American power and its leverage, to stop the wars that are happening in Europe and in the Middle East. These are the biggest issues plaguing the world right now, apart from the climate and certain aspects of immigration. But he didn't, and he kept saying that, you know, I will sanction Putin when Europe sanctions. Well, let's face it, the countries that buy the most oil from Russia right now are Trump's closest friends and Putin's closest allies. Hungary, Orban; Slovakia, Fico; and Turkey of Erdogan. These are very, very, you know, admired by the President of the United States, and these are the ones who are buying the most Russian oil right now. So it was a very on-script, off-script kind of speech. Some of the things he said when he was on-script were, you know, it was written fairly decently, and some of the stuff that he said when he was off-script went into this idea, as I said, of global carnage and conspiracy theories, and, you know, they're condemned to disaster, they're condemned to failure. These were to his allies. Let's just say one more thing. The President of the United States could do a lot of stuff with allies. It's very, very difficult for the United States to try to achieve what the President says the United States wants to achieve without alliances. And as these nations try to manage Trump in Trump 1.0, you can see by the reaction that the idea of managing Trump and humoring him is over now. They've got to just try to figure out how to weather the worst of this storm and hope that what he says off script is not what he means in bilateral conversations with them. Pamela?
Yeah, we'll see, because he has several meetings coming up. We'll see how they go, because several of them are with U.S. allies. And to extend on the point you were making, Christian, how he treated U.S. allies in the room there, he also further isolated the U.S. from U.S. allies when it comes to recognizing Palestinian statehood, saying that doing so would be a reward for Hamas. He also called on Hamas to release all the hostages. Now, I want to play that sound and actually bring in Jim Sciutto after to get his take.
Some of this body is seeking to unilaterally recognize a Palestinian state. The rewards would be too great for Hamas terrorists for their atrocities. This would be a reward for these horrible atrocities, including October 7th, even while they refuse to release the hostages or accept a ceasefire. Instead of giving to Hamas and giving so much, because they have taken so much. This could have been solved so long ago. But instead of giving in to Hamas's ransom demands, those who want peace should be united with one message: release the hostages now. Just release the hostages now. Thank you.
Jim, what is your reaction for those comments at a time when, as I mentioned, several U.S. allies like Canada and France are recognizing Palestinian statehood?
Well, that was the one line from the president's speech that got applause from those assembled, because there is, of course, broad and understandable agreement that everyone wants the hostages to come home. The thing is that even from inside Israel and even from inside Prime Minister Netanyahu's own leadership, some of the former leaders, they say that the Israeli Prime Minister is not prioritizing the hostages and that by expanding military action on the ground, he's endangering their lives. There are open questions in Israel about Israel's priorities as relates to that war. And Trump himself has expressed impatience in the past with the Israeli leaders' focus on bringing that war to an end. But now, based on his comments today, it does not appear that he is putting any limits or any new pressure on Israel to bring that conflict to the end, acknowledging fully that, of course, Hamas is very much a player in this as well and is the one holding those hostages.